It's great to be here. It's my first time in Burlington, and it's very lovely and beautiful. So I'm really enjoying my time here. So as Brian said, I have a sort of a varied, I wouldn't say colorful, I'd say varied background. Um, and I do think it is one of those things that like I wouldn't have foreseen it. And there's just, I guess my motto would be there's opportunity all around you. So if you keep your eyes open, there's always something new to discover. So as Brian said, this is a study that I did in Portland, Oregon. And it's, I think, the first of its kind, and I doubt it's going to be the last. But I'm going to show you some of the results. But in the end, I'm going to actually talk probably more about how this study posed more questions than it probably answered for me. So I'm going to start by talking about some of the things you probably already know, the trends going on in the U.S. in non-automobile transportation. And there's going to be a little bit of an emphasis on bicycling. One, because I live in Portland, and that's such an important mode of transportation for Portland. But also, it's a mode that most cities in the U.S. have less experience with. So walking and transit, we have a longer history of making those investments, but bicycling is relatively a new thing. And I think people have a little more concern about it. So I'm going to talk about these key questions and my study, and then what does it mean for local businesses' bottom line? So the question that planners, transportation planners, have been asking for a long time is if we build it, will they come? And so we've been building all kinds of non-automobile infrastructure, I would say, in the last 20 years, but I would say with a huge emphasis in the last 5. So New York City has made rapid changes to what was auto-dominated plazas and streetscapes, and really recaptured those for pedestrians and bicycles with great success and a very low level of capital investment. I did another study at Portland State with 2 of my colleagues there, Jennifer Dill and Chris Monsier, and we looked a lot at this bike infrastructure, protected bike lanes that are going in around the country. And again, we don't know a whole lot about what are the impacts of these on local businesses. Are they effective in getting people to bicycle? Are they safe? Streetcars, we manufacture streetcars in the US, in Portland, and many communities it's like streetcars are the new light rail, or is it bus rapid transit? But it's like the latest thing that many places are interested in, and just shows that these topics really, we've come full circle. So these are things that were present in many of our towns and communities, and we ripped them up to pave over them for our roadways. And now we're reconsidering or rethinking that. Bike share, is Burlington considering a bike share? Maybe, yes, talking about it. Lots of talk, yeah. Well, Portland's talking about it too. But large cities have made this investment, and New York, Chicago, Washington, D.C. are seeing great success with their programs. Other cities, maybe less so. But again, we don't know a whole lot about how people are going to use it or respond to it. In Portland, we're building the largest non-automobile bridge in the world, I think. We're going to say that, whether it's true or not. And so this bridge is going to have light rail, it's going to have our streetcar, bike and pedestrian infrastructure, and then our buses will have exclusive right-of-way, but no cars. So it's a really cool thing that we're adding. And again, it's going to change the connectivity and travel patterns of Portland. And so with these investments, we're seeing a lot of change in demand, but the biggest places where demand is changing are places where they were sort of better off to start with, or where the network is more developed. So Portland, of course, we're very proud of our bicycling and transit infrastructure, but Chicago, Washington, D.C., New York City, San Francisco, Seattle, Minneapolis, so places where the infrastructure is most robust. And then other places where the demographics match users, so college towns, smaller places like Burlington, where you have young people who are interested in cycling, maybe you have more activism around environmental causes and so on. So what does all this mean? And we have spent, and myself included, studying a lot about the impacts on what do these investments mean for traffic congestion and transportation. And I will say that the evidence is pretty slim. It hasn't had a profound effect on reducing congestion in most of our cities. But it has had, and there's a lot of strong evidence to say that these investments have made a big impact on our health. And so maybe the reasons to invest in these modes aren't solely about transportation and transportation choices, but about health and physical activity. Air quality and climate. So a lot of these investments are justified under the grounds of climate change, and we really need to rethink the way we're building our cities. And then livability and fun doesn't get researched as much, but I think it's one of the organizing concepts around Portland and Portlandia that we are serious about transportation, but we don't take it very seriously. This guy, when I first moved to Portland, was playing Amazing Grace outside of my apartment on Christmas Day. But one of the biggest questions are, what are the implications here for local businesses? And while Portland population supports in general these new investments, some businesses are very cautious about what is this going to mean if you take out parking spaces in front of my business, and put in bike racks. Is this going to hurt my bottom line? And we really haven't done very many studies, very many academic studies. And as far as academic studies, I think mine was the first, and there might be a few more trickling out. But to really understand, what does this mean for economic vitality and individual businesses? So some of the questions I get asked, first of all, they want to know who's going to come. In Portland, anyway, there's an impression of who are bicyclists. They're the youth who come there to retire. They spend all day in the coffee shop. They buy one coffee, and they're there for 5 hours. I really like the people who are driving to work and stop by and get coffee. They don't stay very long. They buy a lot of things. How will they get here? So I don't know that the businesses ask that so much as the researchers, but if we put in this infrastructure, is it going to work? Is it going to be successful? And are they going to bring people? Are people going to use it to come to my business? When will they come? Again, this is probably a question that I ask more than the businesses, but there's some evidence to say that maybe they're not going to come at the same times if they come by different modes, or on the same days that people who come by automobile may come. How often will they come? So how frequently will they come by my store? And then the big question, how much are they going to spend? So are they going to come to my coffee shop and buy one coffee with a refill and stay all day and blog? So what does this all mean for the bottom line? And so I'm going to talk about the study again that I've done in Portland. It's actually in the Portland metro area, so not just the 600,000 Portlandia that you're probably familiar with, but the 1.5 million metropolitan region. And so as part of the study, I surveyed almost 90 businesses, and they were across 4 different types of business. So convenience stores, high turnover sit-down restaurants, so not quite fast food. None of them have drive-thrus, for example. Drinking places, bars, we have an abundance of those in Portland. And then supermarkets. And so if you think about each of these businesses and what sort of modes you might use to access them, there's a lot of different things that you might consider. So if you're going shopping at a grocery store, you're purchasing things that you have to carry. And so walking or biking or taking transit might inhibit your choice. But if you're going to a bar or a restaurant, what you're purchasing goes in your belly, and so you're carrying it home with you. And so does it have as much of an impact on your mode choice? And so we picked these in part because they were the most common businesses that the cities in our study talked about having difficulties in siting in terms of infill development. And in Oregon, we have what's called transportation system development charges or impact fees. And so they are the businesses that we have a really hard time citing because we don't know that much about what are their traffic impacts. So the project goals here were to understand what the mode shares are at each of these businesses. And then a big theme of my work is understanding what's the relationship with land use and travel behavior. So if we saw these different mode shares at these different establishments, what are the characteristics of the built environment that were associated with different modes? And then probably most important for this talk today is, how much did people spend and how much did people report frequenting that establishment? So Brian mentioned that I have a background of working in surveys, and so we did a survey at these places, and we intercepted patrons and customers as they left these establishments. And so these are all the questions that we asked. We asked about how they got there, how much did they spend, how often do you come to this establishment right here. We asked about their gender, we asked where they lived, and we asked some other questions about income and their resources that they might have at their household, and then a few other questions about travel that I'm not going to report today. And we did these on Monday through Thursday in the evening peak. So we didn't do them all day long. It's just for this 5 to 7 p.m. And we did this in May through October. So if you know anything about Portland, the rain doesn't really stop until July, but it's a little bit better weather. So in the cases that I'm reporting, it's probably the most optimistic mode shares, because as winter moves along, it's probably the same thing here. You get people shift modes away from biking and walking to other things. Supermarkets, we had to use a slightly different mechanism. We partnered with a local chain, and they do the survey every year of their customers. And so they didn't want us to ask too many personal questions about income and their household. They were most interested in how much they spent. And so we intercepted them at the cash register. And we had like 20,000 respondents. So we did that survey for an entire week. From their hours from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. and for an entire week in April. And we sampled about 10% of their customer base, so it was a pretty healthy amount, where in the other survey, I think we had about 1,000 respondents across those 4 business types. We used a tablet, not such a big deal now, but it was a big deal then in terms of intercepting people and having them do the survey on a tablet. And so there you see people struggling to understand what we're asking of them. So to get to those questions then. So the other data source that I'm going to use to sort of substantiate some points is our recent household travel survey from the state of Oregon, and I've done some analysis of this for the bike and pedestrian plan for Oregon DOT. And so again, there's this perception that people who walk and bike are very low income. And from this, you see it's sort of binodal in a way, that people on the lower end of the spectrum are more likely to walk, but also people on the high income spectrum are more likely to walk. Percent of households. So 40% of the household, let's see, does this work? Yeah, so here it's 40% of the households that make 150,000 or more reported making a walk trip if they lived in Portland. So we see a somewhat similar trend in cycling, that people who are cycling for transportation tend to be at the higher income level, but we do see a little node here on the other end. And we see more of an emphasis in Portland, to the biggest city in Oregon, and also known for cycling. This is just if they made one in the survey. So if they made at least one, they count in 1 day. So the household travel surveys will contact households, and everyone in the household reports all of their travel and travel characteristics for the 1 day that they're sampled. Okay, then from our survey, and this resolution isn't necessarily great in here, but it tells maybe a slightly different story. So across our drinking places, restaurants, drinking places, and convenience stores, we do see a slightly different distribution. So people who drive tend to have higher incomes, and people who bicycle tend to have lower incomes. So this was just for the trip to those places. So when he intercepted them and said, "How did you get here today?" this was their response, and they reported their income to us. So it runs a little bit counter to that data that I just showed you, but it may have something to do with the trip purpose. These aren't commute trips. These are non-work trips. So again, this resolution isn't the best one to show this, nor are these little pies the best way to show this. But the pies are the different mode shares, and so red is the percent of the trips that each one of these pies is an establishment that participated in our study. And so the red shows the automobile mode share, green is walk, blue is bicycle, and purple is transit. And so this inset area here is downtown Portland. So in places where you would expect to have higher non-automobile mode shares, and that's fairly true. But then you get out here in the suburbs and you see some places have much higher non-auto. They're still auto-dominated, but there's some places where people aren't just driving there. And I think there's a huge presumption that if you're in the suburbs, nobody walks or nobody takes transit. Everybody's going to drive, and this surprised some of the business owners, because even though they had a pretty good idea of what people are spending in their store, they really didn't know very much about how they got there. And so this breaks this down by the different types of businesses. And so no surprise, supermarkets, where you have the biggest load to carry or travel burden, is dominated by the automobile. But drinking places, I don't know if this is because people are drinking and driving responsibly, or it says something more about Portland drinking and bicycling, but you see a very different distribution of modes across drinking places. High turnover restaurants. So again, there's a fairly healthy share of people who walk there. And then convenience stores. So the convenience store chain that partnered with us was really surprised to see the number of people that bicycle. They had no idea that they had a 7% bike mode share. And so as a response to this study, they started putting bike racks in all of their convenience stores. And then they said that the phone started ringing off the hook of bicyclists thanking them. And they said, no one calls the customer service line to say thank you. Everyone calls to complain. So, the takeaway here is people are still driving. So that's no surprise. But I think these mode shares are fairly significant. And then if you think about the map that we just showed, it's not just downtown Portland that we see these changes. So then one of the things that we thought to ask for our survey of grocery store patrons is, how often do you use the mode that you just told me you used to get to the store today? How often do you use it to travel to the store? And so one of the things that we see is that people aren't single modal people, that people have a variety of ways that they get around. But if you talk to transportation planners or even the advocacy community, we seem to separate ourselves into, I'm a bicyclist, or I'm a pedestrian, or I'm a transit rider, or I'm a motorist. But in reality, we're just people who get around our city however we can. But we do see that people who reported an automobile trip tend to use that most often. But people who said that they came, interestingly, by biking and by transit, only use that mode about half the time. So I thought this was sort of telling, because often in our travel surveys, I don't know what it is about this, but we only survey people once for one day. And I don't know if it's you guys just don't want to fill out surveys more than one day, but when we try to do that, it's like you'll do a good job, not you personally, but do a good job for the first day, and then the second day it's like, I'm bored with this. But in other countries, like Germany, and Germans are very different than Americans, but they'll do a travel survey for 6 weeks at a time. And so there we really get to see the long view. What happens when it rains? What happens when you don't go to work one day? So you really get to see this kind of variation. And I think it's very helpful, because a one-day snapshot of what you do isn't a very good portrait across the week or even across the year. So this is another question I've been asking when we started looking at the grocery store travel. And so this is shopping trips, and these are data that came from, again, that Oregon Household Travel Survey. And so while the counts are very small, what we were interested in is the time of day. So how are these trips distributed across the time of day? And so if you know anything about traffic engineers, they are obsessed with the peak hour. So nothing happens unless it's in the morning peak and the afternoon peak. That's the only time we collect data. That's the time that we really want to focus on signal timing, for example. And so the evening peak is this blue shade. But we see that a lot of the trips, particularly if you're walking and biking, the peak, now granted these are smaller numbers, but the peak hour is not during the peak hour. The peak hour is a bit earlier. And then dining out. Again, you see this difference. So when do people walk to dine out? Well, at the lunch hour. This is interesting to me, this little bubble right here. I think this is the stop for coffee, right? And then you see another, so vehicle trips are made at lunchtime and dinner time, but a really different distribution. And so, this is just one sort of examination, and these numbers are kind of small, but it sort of makes us think, well, maybe we should stop obsessing about this morning and evening peak, because things happen throughout the day, and you might actually start to see that we're walking and cycling way more than we think we are as a community or as a country. We're just not asking people the right time of day. So then how often do they make these trips? So again, we asked how much you spend, and then how often do you come to this establishment? So again, a huge variation in number of trips by mode. So if you see here at supermarkets, if you reported walking, you come over 12 times, 13 times a month to that grocery store, where if you drive, you're just coming 8. So it's 4 more trips a month. Now that makes sense, again, because if you have to carry your things home with you, you're not buying as much, you're going to have to go more often to provision for your household. But restaurants and drinking establishments don't have that problem, right? So there shouldn't be necessarily a relationship between how often you come to an establishment and what mode that you take. But we see for restaurants and bikes, for restaurants, that transit users and cyclists are coming way, way more often than people who are driving. And same thing with drinking establishments, right? You see this trend here. And then convenience stores, we see people who walk again. You're carrying stuff home, so they're coming more often. So again, that's telling because, again, all of these businesses tended to know how much consumers were spending at each trip, so each registered transaction, but they really didn't have a sense how many times a person's walking through the door of their store. So then the question everybody wants to know, okay, well, now that they're in my store, how much are they going to spend? So supermarkets, obviously, people spend more because they're going to buy more food. And it's probably no surprise that people who drive spend a lot more than other modes. But if you remember, this isn't that far behind, right? So it's about $25 $35 per trip for transit and cyclist, about $30. So $30 to $35 for non-automobile modes. But if you remember, they were coming, the pedestrians were making 4 more trips. So similarly, the restaurants, so how much are they spending? Again, you wouldn't think that it would matter for eating and drinking how much you're spending. Maybe drinking, right? We did see in our models this sort of margarita effect that people who weren't driving tended to have an expenditure on the order of about $6 more, so 1 more drink than people who were driving. So these weren't incredibly statistically different from one another, and same with convenience stores. But then, again, when you combine it with these average frequencies, you see that it comes out about in the wash. So for all of these, when you take the average spending and the average number of trips, it's not that different at the end of the month. Now, I'm not going to bore you with all of my models, but I'm putting this up here so that to prove that I did them. But instead, I'm just going to tell you what they told me. So what I showed previously were just descriptive statistics, but we really wanted to dig deeper and control for a lot of other different factors. So do they have kids in the household? How much money do they make? What mode did they take? And so on, to see what the impact was on spending for that trip. And so when we put all that stuff in there for restaurants, bars, and convenience stores, the mode that they took didn't matter at all. So there were no significant differences in spending for trip for bicycles versus cars. They were all about the same. But demographics did matter. So higher income spent more at restaurants. That makes sense. Young people buy more at convenience stores. Men buy more at convenience stores. Is that true? I think it's true. Well, you see what this says about grocery stores here in a minute. And then oddly, for convenience stores, frequency really mattered. So oddly, the more you go to a convenience store, the more you spend per trip. So that seems to suggest to me one of two things. It could be that people are relying more on convenience stores for their provisioning needs. So particularly if you're talking about the suburbs where they might have not great access to grocery stores. Or it means we have a drinking problem in Portland and people are buying too much PBR. For supermarkets, however, mode really was significant there. So again, this makes sense, but auto users spend more. So pedestrians spend about 20% less once we control for everything else. Cyclists spend about 15%, and people who arrive by transit spend 10% less. It also mattered for non-automobile modes how far you had to travel. So again, it makes sense if you have to bike a long way with your groceries, you might buy less or walk a long way with your groceries than if you only had to walk a block. Here for supermarkets, the more frequently you go, however, the less you spend. So again, that made sense to me, that you're making lots of small trips if you're walking and biking to the store. So while men spend more at the convenience store, they spend less at the supermarket. I don't know exactly what that means, but I thought it was interesting. And then we looked at time of day and day of week, and so people bought more on the weekends. So these are things we all do, so this probably isn't a surprise to you, right? Everyone goes to the grocery store on Saturday morning or on Sunday and buys stuff for the week if you're driving. But it was interesting to sort of put it all together with the mode of transportation. So that's the empirical evidence that I have, but after thinking about sort of how do I interpret, how do I explain this, and what's the next study I'm going to do, I started thinking, well, what does this mean? What do I tell the business community, and what do I want to work on next? So I guess the first thing is the automobile is still the dominant mode. That's not a surprise, but there were huge variations in use across Portland, and in some places that I thought were really surprising. So in places that were very large arterials, we see a lot of people walking to convenience stores, and it really made me want to understand more about that. These are, I think a lot of advocates call these the invisible trips, so things that we're not acknowledging and counting. We're looking for pedestrians where pedestrians sort of congregate. We're counting pedestrians in the ped mall, but we're not really looking for pedestrians out in the suburbs. Well, I didn't show this in the models, that parking supply made a big difference. So if there were off-street parking, people took advantage of it because it's free and convenient. But in places where we had made accommodations for other modes, so there was good transit access, there was good bike parking, there was next to a low-stress bike way or bike path, we saw use of those modes rise. So I started thinking about this a little bit more, and that question about how often do you come to this establishment right here? And so why would people who walk or bike come more often to restaurants and bars than people who drive? It just didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I mean, the advocates love that story, but like why? And so I started thinking, well, maybe if you have an automobile, or you're choosing to go by automobile, you have more variety in the places you go. So you might not just stick to the neighborhood or the places that are close to work and the places that are close to home, and you might drive to other neighborhoods or to other cities to go to restaurants or bars. But people who walk and bike might be really important for those neighborhood businesses. They come back. They're your regulars. They're the return customers that business owners have a relationship with, that they know them by name, by face, perhaps. And so I think that these are real trade-offs to think about. So it's part of the story that I think needs to be investigated a little bit more. So whether or not a business benefits from non-auto infrastructure or cycling infrastructure is going to vary a lot by businesses. So when I give this talk in Portland, the guy that owns the auto repair shop and the guy that owns the mattress store say, okay, but this isn't going to help me. This is going to hurt me. And in Portland, people will buy a mattress and bring it home on a bike. That does happen, but the vast majority of people don't do that. So how do we explain to that? Are there business? How much is it going to hurt, and how much is it going to help? I can't answer that with this one study. But one thing that we know is the mode wasn't as important as the demographics. So if we could understand more about the customer base for different types of businesses, we might be able to understand more about the implications for mode shifts. The other thing is that there's been a lot of interest in this, where cities are doing some self-studies. New York did a self-study of all of the plazas and bike investments they've been made and compared those corridors to other corridors. And so it showed that where people were walking and biking more, that those stores and corridors were more economic, they had a bigger return on investment. But the one thing that we know, or one thing that is obvious to me in Portland, is that where we're making these investments tend to be places where we're making other kinds of economic development investments, or these are corridors that we're putting a lot of emphasis on improving what's happening in that place. So it's not just that there's new bike infrastructure or new trolley line. It's also that we've offered incentives for businesses to go there, or subsidies for low interest business loans and those kinds of things. And then finally, there might be soft benefits. So it may be that I'm not going to buy that mattress and bring it home on my bike, but I might know that the mattress store is there because I bike by it every day, and I'll go home and come back. So understanding how the visibility might improve by people using one mode, we know that there's a lot of variation. So how do we understand some of these soft benefits that might exist from walking and biking? So then I start thinking, because someone asked me, well, if, again, this question, what I can't answer from my study, if we take away a parking spot outside my business and I put in a bike rack, what's the implication of that? What's it mean for my bottom line? And I can't answer that, but I'm thinking a lot about it. So if I drive and now I choose to bike, it might also mean frequency and timing of my trip might change. So I might just stop at the grocery store on my way home from work to get a few things, and then I go on Saturday for my big provisioning. Now I'm not going to do that, and instead I'm going to go much more often. See, I knew I shouldn't animate. I also might change my route. So if I'm here or near here and I want to go to the farmhouse where I had lunch yesterday, it was lovely, I might choose to drive down, College, Maine. I might choose to drive down Maine and take a fairly direct route. I think it takes like 4 minutes. But if I bike, I might want to get off Maine, right, and take another route. So that has implications, again, for planners. Again, it's a no-brainer, but I think it's things that we don't think about. We seem to think that it's just a simple substitution. We take away, I'm not going to drive anymore, I'm going to bike, and that's as simple as that. But I'm going at a different time, I might be going more often, and now I'm taking a different route than I would travel. Well, maybe I'm not going to travel there at all. So maybe I'm like, I don't want to ride my bike back up the hill for lunch. So instead, I'm going to stay right here in the student center and eat at the place downstairs, right? So I might now change my destination because there's somewhere that's more accessible. Then again, if I'm going more often, you might see the amount that I spend per trip change. So we don't really have even though these aren't very complicated questions, these are complicated behaviors, but these are all things that you think about and do in your daily lives. But if we're trying to understand how we should respond, or what are the implications for a 10% mode shift away from driving to walking and biking, we really don't have an understanding of what does that mean for our local businesses at all. But it's not a one-to-one substitution, unless maybe you're commuting. So if I decide not to commute by car and I decide to commute by bus, I'm not going to work more often, right? That probably is a one-to-one substitution. But for other kinds of trips, I think it has this sort of, you pull on that thread and it gets more and more complicated as the story unravels. So then I start thinking about this, what are the implications of more frequent visits? So you're spending less, but you're going more often to a grocery store, for example. So you're in the store more often. So if you're a business owner, that's probably a good thing, right? You have some loyalty, some attachment, they know who you are, they know what products you sell. You might be more responsive to their needs because you know them. Hey, I want some of that, what is it, heady topper, right? I want you to carry that all the time. When I go back to Portland, I'm going to see what I can get. But on the other hand, I might be a more captive consumer. So I might not have choices to go other places because I'm reliant on a non-auto mode. But there is this opportunity to think about marketing and customer loyalty programs for these kinds of businesses, or for these kinds of customers. But then if I've got somebody in my store that's spending less, but they're still requiring labor costs for me, so I still have to staff my store with just as many people because these people are in there more often, but they're buying less per hour, let's say. I might have to hire more people to accommodate these more frequent trips, but at the end of the month, I'm not necessarily getting more revenue. So I don't know. I think this is something we need to think about in terms of operating costs and what kind of business, and what does this really mean for the bottom line. There may be other kinds of cost savings to businesses, but usually businesses that start from the ground up. So land acquisition costs. If I don't have to build as much parking for my grocery store, I can buy a smaller lot. But if I'm infill, you usually don't think about, well, I'm going to buy this land, but I'm going to slice off this piece for the parking lot because I'm not going to use it. But you could think about using that property more fully for your business if you don't have to supply as much auto parking. So a few thoughts to conclude. So first of all, I think we need to adopt more of a multimodal mentality. So every time I talk about transportation to different groups, everybody has sort of a vested interest or identifies themselves with a particular group. And I think now is time to, if you look at this variety, people who are cyclists in Portland are drivers in Portland too. So how do we sort of think about this more fully, but yet advocate for changes that we would like? So we need to stop being single-moded, a single-moded mentality. This is clearly just the very beginning, so we need a whole lot more research, so I'm going to say that up front. But since we are doing all these investments, we really have the opportunity to start thinking about natural experiments, so doing more before and after kinds of studies, because that's where we really can evaluate change the best. Sales tax information, so we don't have sales tax in Oregon. But there is an opportunity if you have sales tax or local option sales tax to track over time what happens in a corridor and really understand more there because there's a way to get objective revenue information from different businesses. We need to study more business types, so I just looked at 4. There's clearly many more, and the implications are going to be different depending on what business they're in and what environment they're in. So whether they are in a central city, whether they are transit accessible, or where they are in the suburbs. And then weigh this information and implications for businesses against the other costs and benefits that we might see. So we already have been weighing in on the health benefits, on the livability benefits, on traffic and climate benefits. So let's just add this into the mix so we can get a much more a fuller picture about our return on investments. And then finally, I did this study, and one thing I think about is the people who cycle in Portland now, or walk or take transit, are probably not going to be the same types of people that do this in the future, right? So today we have the stereotype of who's cycling, right? So it's college students, young adults, mostly men, affluent. Mayor Rahm Emanuel talked about justifying his investments in cycling because he wanted to capture all the creative class. He wanted to attract them to Chicago because he thought cycling was correlated with creative class. Hipsters, there's no argument there, and the people who are environmentally conscious. But in the future, It might be we see many more women cycling, children, retirees. It might just become more of the norm. And so all of these things about spending patterns and travel patterns, whether they hold into the future, we should probably hold off on using this kind of data to forecast because it's becoming more popular. And so women who cycle might have very different considerations on route and destination and time than men, for example. So lots of people have been funding this work, and it's been really interesting, and I'm ready to do more. And I'd like to thank you for bringing me here. This is great.
So I want to do a quick thank you. We always present our guests with gifts from Vermont, and they're all travel safe, so you don't have to check your luggage.
Great.
Also, one more public service announcement. There's going to be a reception with food just by the fireplace right after this. We usually have a lot more food than most, so I highly encourage you to spend your time conversing with our speaker. We will take some questions now, but there's going to be quite a bit of time afterwards for you to be mingling among each other and also with Kelly as well. So why don't you take some questions?
Do we want to give this to people, or I can hear you. It's not a big room. Oh, okay. Is it on? I need to turn it on.
Hello? Okay.
I was wondering for future research if you've considered what the impacts might be in terms of money being spent among cyclists outside of the community. So having moved from driving to work into cycling for last year, I noticed that I buy a heck of a lot more stuff online nowadays because I'm too lazy to alter my path on the way home. I just bought a salt shaker on Amazon because I can't be bothered to alter my bike trip on the way home. So I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
We just had an interesting discussion. My colleague Jennifer Dill and the people part of Track our UTC about this because we find that we're all using Amazon more for little trips. So I think how the internet and how information technology plays in this, I think, is a huge component. And I think that, again, the stereotype of cyclists are people who are more tech savvy, who are more aware of options, who are, looking for the best deal. So I think it's a great thought, but I haven't looked at it in terms of a sort of a whole household budget and where money is going in and out. But I think that's really what's needed. And I think the less we use cash, the more it probably is easy to sort of be able to allow people to track their expenditures across locations. So.
Well, I've bicycled around Portland, so I know what kind of a community you're investigating. So I'm wondering if there's any parallel research done on just about any other less cycling-friendly city in the country of this kind of similar questions you've asked, and how does Portland stand up, or how does your data stand up compared to other cities?
Yeah, so as far as I know, no. I think there's a couple master's theses out there somewhere that start to look at this topic, and I know my colleague and mentor Susan Handy has just done something similar in Davis, but Davis is also a cycling city. But I do have some money from the Summit Foundation and Bikes Belong to look at cities outside of Portland and to do more with the tax records. So what we won't be able to do with tax records is look at individual establishments because that's confidential information, but we would be able to look across a corridor or across several city blocks over time.
So you looked at the benefits for businesses of people who arrive by a variety of modes. I'm curious what you think it would take to get to a point where you'd be able to say something about not the benefits for existing businesses, but the business profile that would be most likely to attract one mode or another, like supermarkets of different sizes. Is there a smaller supermarket footprint that is more walk-bike friendly and less oriented towards cars? How you hinted at it at the end, but what are your thoughts about kind of getting ahead of this curve and being able to say to businesses, hey, if you really want to attract people walking and biking, here's what's beyond the bike rack. Here's all the things you can do about how you site, design, market, et cetera, your business to maximize that opportunity?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's actually a study that I'm starting in January. So sort of parallel with this effort was an effort to look at trip generation, which is the Institute of Transportation Engineers publishes this sort of compendium of data that are often used when we're citing new businesses, so back to this transportation development charges. And so this study was done in parallel with an effort to show that how bad those data are in places that have good transit, good cycling, and good pedestrian infrastructure. And so our first broad brush there was to look at sort of macro level built environment, so things like residential densities, mixed use, street network, bike network, transit frequency, and those things. And so in January, I'm working with an urban designer, and we're going to start sort of taking the data, looking at it again, but looking at the site level. So how much does it matter, the square footage, the footprint of the building to the site? Does the site have orientation to the sidewalk? What is the circulation in the parking lot? Where is the bike parking? And those sorts of things. So with that in mind. So so I was telling the anecdote about the chain, the Plaid Pantry chain is the convenience store that I worked with. And so they started putting in bike racks, and they did get some feedback to say, you're doing it wrong. And so they changed it. And so, you know, it isn't just putting a bike rack, it's where you put it on the site. Is it in, you know, is it visible, and those sorts of things. So I think are really important, and we want to start offering those guidelines to businesses in Portland.
I'm not sure if you know the answer, but the Pac-Man slide that you had, I was wondering, the communities that were out in the hinterlands, some of them had a lot of green, non-automobile, and I was wondering if you had been able to go back and see what the characteristics of those communities or the surrounding area around those businesses were.
So usually the ones that had good transit access were on one of our light rail lines or proximate to a light rail line, or they backed up to a neighborhood. So they either had good access to a residential area, so even though they're on two sort of ostensibly horrible environments to walk or cycle, that we think that they have good access through the back for pedestrians, or they're near light rail. But that's also something we're going to look at in this next study. And one of my colleagues at the University of Oregon has done, he's the urban designer that I'm working with, has looked a lot at connectivity issues in the suburbs. So looking at multifamily housing in the suburbs that tends to be built around big box retail. So sort of these luxury apartment buildings that are at big interchanges, and found that if you just connect them to the target, that they'll actually walk to the target. No brainer, but this is the kind of research I do. Yeah. Other questions?
And the average?
Yeah, so we did, but because they're both averages, a lot of the variation, that's where it does come out in the wash. So when we look at the monthly expenditures, I just didn't show that because I think they're not that statistically different.
Any other questions?
So I do, John? I was just curious. It seems like we're seeing a lot more electric bicycles out there.
Yeah.
And I have a feeling there's more to come.
Yeah.
I was curious if you've given that any thoughts and what the implications of that would be.
For businesses or just in general?
For your findings of these studies.
Yeah, so we are thinking about that a lot in Portland. I think that it has probably more implications for places like San Francisco and Seattle, where it's a lot more hilly terrain. Portland's fairly flat, although to the west we do have a fairly significant hill there, or range that's sort of separating Portland from the western suburbs. And so I think for people who live on with this kind of landscape, they're just currently not walking or cycling very much. And so I think having electric e-bikes is going to be able to help them use these modes more often. So I haven't thought about the expenditure piece, but again, if you can haul more and it isn't really, you don't have to expend more effort, it seems like it would have a positive thing. But I think there's a positive impact. But I think there's a whole other set of things about these bikes that can accelerate more quickly, travel at slightly higher speed. So how are they going to work on our traditional bike infrastructure, which in many places isn't very generous to begin with? And we see that in China, where they have a lot more electric bikes than we have. And so how does that mix with the traditional bike is going to have probably more safety implications than probably economic ones.
So you mentioned like China just then and how they're using electric bicycles, and you mentioned Germany earlier and how they're taking a lot more surveys. How are you using that information in the stuff that you're doing with Portland?
The information from
like the Germany surveys and like.
Oh, well, I'm not using the Germany survey, but yeah, I wish we could do more of that. I think that more passive technology, so smartphones, for example, if people are more willing to engage with those, we have the opportunity to collect a lot more information. We know that Google is collecting a lot more information, so every time you search on a map, you know, it's getting an idea of the places you're interested in. And I have an Android phone that tells me when I'm sitting at a cafe when my bus is coming next. Do you want to pay your bill now? The bus is going to come in 6 minutes. And I volunteer. I mean, I'm letting it tell me that information. But we're much more reticent to tell the government where we're going. And so how do we sort of bring transportation planners, government at the table and talk about this? And because this information is, I think, really critical for us to be able to think about planning cities and being really responsive. And it's getting harder and harder to get people to fill out these surveys, and it is only for one day. So how do we sort of balance this need for privacy with the wealth of information that we could have access to improve our environment?